Angie Hausman was born on February 18, 1984, in St. Louis, Missouri. Her father left before she was born, and she never had the chance to know him. When Angie was just a year old, her mother remarried a man named Ronald, and together they had a son. Angie quickly grew attached to her younger brother, and the two shared a close bond. She was a bright and friendly child, eager to make friends and connect with everyone around her. Angie's family lived in a quiet suburb of St. Louis, the kind of place where neighbors looked out for one another and kids played freely outside. By 1993, Angie was 9 years old and in the 4th grade. She attended an elementary school just over a mile from her home. Each day, she caught the school bus from a nearby stop just a few hundred yards away. Her parents felt comfortable letting her make the short walk alone, especially since she usually traveled with other neighborhood kids. On the way home, a group of parents routinely watched from their windows to make sure the children got back safely. It had become a kind of informal neighborhood system, simple but effective. On November 18th, Angie followed her usual routine. She went to school, finished her day around 3 p.m., and took the bus back to her neighborhood. She got off at her stop with the other kids, and they all started walking home together. As they reached their houses, the group slowly broke up. Angie lived a little farther than the rest, and before long, she was walking alone. It was only a short distance, just a few minutes from where the others left her. But this time, Angie never made it home. About 30 minutes passed before her parents began to worry. Angie was known to stop and chat, but she was never this late. Her mother and stepfather went outside to retrace her route. They asked other neighborhood children if they'd seen her, and they all gave the same answer. Angie had gotten off the bus with them and headed in the direction of her house. Somewhere along that short, familiar walk home, Angie vanished. Angie's parents didn't waste any time. After speaking with a few neighbors, particularly the women who usually kept watch over the kids from their windows, they quickly realized that neither had seen anything that afternoon. Both had been preoccupied that day, leaving a rare gap in the neighborhood's usual sense of security. Worried, Angie's parents and friends sprang into action. They began combing the area between the bus stop and their home, calling out her name and searching nearby yards, alleys, and wooded patches. As daylight faded and evening set in, panic grew. With no sign of Angie, her parents called the police. Officers arrived promptly and joined the search. Given the cold November weather, police doubted Angie had wandered off voluntarily, and they immediately began to consider more troubling possibilities. That concern was amplified by a disturbing incident that had occurred just 10 days earlier in a nearby neighborhood. An 11-year-old girl had nearly been abducted after getting off her school bus. A man had tried to drag her into the bushes, but she escaped. The suspect had never been caught. Now, with Angie missing under eerily similar circumstances, investigators couldn't ignore the possibility that the same predator was behind this case. Police brought in K-9 units to aid in the search. The dogs picked up Angie's scent near the bus stop and followed it along the route toward her home. But then, about halfway there, the trail abruptly vanished. This suggested she may have been picked up by someone in a vehicle, reinforcing fears that she had been abducted. Search efforts expanded quickly. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging scanned the area from above, while officers searched the banks of a nearby stream. But by the end of that first day, there were no answers, no sign of Angie, and no trace of her belongings. By the next morning, police turned to the public for help. Local media picked up the story, and within hours, word of Angie's disappearance spread across the city. Tips started pouring in. The department received more than 300 calls in a single day, so many that over 20 additional officers had to be brought in to manage the response. But despite the overwhelming number of leads, none of them brought investigators any closer to finding Angie Houseman. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. In the early days of the investigation, detectives explored every possible scenario, and that included taking a closer look at Angie's stepfather. As is standard in missing child cases, those closest to the victim were scrutinized first. The man insisted he had nothing to do with Angie's disappearance and claimed he would never harm her. Eager to clear his name, he agreed to take a polygraph and undergo any other checks detectives requested. He told investigators he simply wanted them to stop focusing on him and start using their time to find his stepdaughter. Police also tracked down Angie's biological father, and what they learned raised some eyebrows. Though he had never been involved in Angie's life, her mother claimed he had occasionally driven past their home, watching as Angie played outside. It was a disturbing detail, and detectives initially found it suspicious. But the man had a solid, verifiable alibi, and ultimately, he was ruled out. By the third day of the investigation, the FBI joined the case, and even more local officers were reassigned to assist. Everyone involved understood the grim reality. If Angie had been taken, she would not survive long in the frigid November temperatures. Time was running out. Around this time, police received a promising lead. A tipster reported seeing a suspicious man slowly cruising through Angie's neighborhood in a blue sedan around the time she vanished. The description of the driver bore a striking resemblance to the man who had attempted to abduct an 11-year-old girl just 10 days earlier. Investigators quickly put together a composite sketch, which was shared with the media and distributed widely. Volunteers printed and handed out thousands of flyers across the region. But despite the exposure, the man's identity remained unknown. As media attention grew, Angie's case was picked up by national television, generating an even greater influx of leads. Detectives worked through every tip that came in, but none brought them any closer to finding her. With the case now dominating headlines, psychics began to insert themselves. Several called Angie's home, offering up visions of where she might be. One even insisted the girl was alive and being held in a large national park, 25 miles from the family's home. But the investigators, grounded in hard evidence, chose not to pursue these claims. They knew they needed real leads, not guesses. In an effort to generate more leads, authorities offered a $10,000 reward for any information about Angie's whereabouts. The incentive sparked a fresh wave of tips, but none led to her. Then, investigators uncovered a deeply unsettling detail. Just days before her disappearance, Angie had told one of her teachers that she was planning to go on a nature trip with her uncle. But there was a catch. Angie didn't have an uncle, at least not one known to the family. Her parents were baffled. They had never heard of such a trip, and no relative had mentioned taking her anywhere. This prompted a troubling theory. Perhaps Angie knew her abductor, at least well enough to trust him. Referring to him as uncle could have been a way to explain the relationship, either to herself or to others. Investigators pursued the lead vigorously, but were unable to identify this mysterious figure. For several more days, the investigation stalled. Leads went nowhere. The community remained on edge. But then, on November 27th, 9 days after Angie disappeared, everything changed. A hunter called the police after making a grim discovery in the August A. Bush Memorial Conservation Area, a large national park located just outside of St. Louis. He had found a human body in the woods. When officers arrived, they were met with a horrifying scene. The body of a young girl had been tied to a tree. She was completely unclothed, and her head was tightly wrapped in duct tape, with only her nose left uncovered. Her hands were bound with metal handcuffs. Nearby, investigators found a bag containing personal belongings, including notebooks with the name Angie Houseman written inside. The body was quickly identified and turned over to medical examiners. What they found was even more devastating. Once the tape was removed, examiners discovered a piece of underwear had been stuffed into Angie's mouth. Based on the condition of her body, they determined that she had been kept alive for most of the 9 days she was missing. Incredibly, she had died only hours before her body was found, from exposure. She had frozen to death, alone in the woods. The autopsy also confirmed that Angie had suffered numerous injuries and had been sexually assaulted. The investigation had gone from a frantic search to a brutal reality. Angie hadn't simply vanished. She had endured 9 days of unimaginable suffering, and someone had orchestrated it with chilling precision. Forensic analysts meticulously examined every item recovered from the scene where Angie's body was found. On the duct tape used to bind her head, they made a promising discovery: a single fingerprint. Investigators ran it through criminal databases and compared it to prints from multiple suspects, hoping for a breakthrough. But no match was found. The lead went nowhere. In the aftermath of Angie's death, the St. Louis Police Department intensified its efforts. More resources were dedicated to the case. The brutality of the crime had left the local community shaken. Parents were terrified. Children were no longer allowed to walk alone. Moms and dads waited at bus stops, escorted their kids to school, and kept them within sight at all times. What had once been a safe suburban neighborhood was now gripped by fear. That fear only deepened a few days later. On December 1st, less than 2 weeks after Angie's body was discovered, another child vanished. This time it was 10-year-old Casey, who lived just 10 miles away. That afternoon, Casey had asked her mother if she could go visit friends who lived only a few hundred yards down the street. But she never made it there. She simply disappeared on the short walk to their house. The case was immediately classified as high priority, and police launched a large-scale search. Detectives couldn't ignore the timing or the similarities. 2 young girls, abducted just days apart, within miles of each other. It raised an alarming question. Was there a serial predator at large? Investigators didn't rule out the possibility that the same person was responsible for both abductions. But they had no physical evidence linking the 2 cases. Then, 10 days later, searchers found Casey's body in St. Louis. She had been wrapped in 2 bedsheets and covered with a pink curtain. The autopsy revealed that she had died from multiple blunt force injuries to the head, a violent and direct cause of death. Despite their efforts, detectives found no clues pointing to a suspect, and the differences between the 2 crimes began to stand out. Angie had been held captive, restrained, and tortured before dying of exposure. Casey had been killed swiftly by blunt force trauma. The method, the timeline, and the manner were all distinct. Slowly, detectives began to consider a chilling new theory. These weren't the work of one killer, but 2. 2 predators. 2 girls. 1 city. 1 month. Detectives eventually identified the man who had attempted to abduct an 11-year-old girl just days before Angie Houseman went missing. He was 37-year-old Gary, a man who frequently traveled to St. Louis for work. Investigators immediately looked into whether he could be linked to the murders of Angie or Casey. But Gary had a rock-solid alibi. Records showed he wasn't in the city during the time either girl disappeared. While he wasn't connected to the homicides, Gary did admit to assaulting 4 other girls during his travels. He was ultimately convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Then, in February of the following year, detectives got a long-awaited break in Casey's case. When her body was discovered, officers had noted tire tracks near the scene. Photos of the tracks were sent to forensic experts, who determined that they had been left by a pickup truck commonly used by a well-known car rental company. The truck's branding, bold and easily recognizable, gave detectives a new strategy. They canvassed Casey's neighborhood, asking residents if they had seen a rental pickup in the area around the time of her disappearance. Their efforts paid off. One woman recalled seeing a branded rental pickup parked near her neighbor's home about a week after Casey went missing. Police quickly zeroed in on the address. Inside the home lived a woman with her partner and her brother. When questioned, the woman insisted that no one in the household had rented a pickup and that they had nothing to do with the case. But detectives weren't convinced. They obtained a search warrant, and during their sweep of the home, investigators made a chilling discovery. Blood traces belonging to Casey were found in the basement, along with the murder weapon. Further investigation revealed what the household had failed to disclose. The woman's brother, Thomas, had in fact rented the pickup in question. Confronted with the evidence, Thomas initially denied everything, but under pressure he finally confessed. The case of Casey's murder was now solved, but Angie Hausman's killer was still out there. According to his confession, Thomas claimed that Casey had knocked on his door that day, hoping to invite his nephews outside to play. He told her to come inside and led her to the basement. Once there, he attempted to assault her, but when Casey began to scream, he panicked, striking her with a heavy object. After killing her, he wrapped her body in bedsheets. Remarkably, after the murder, Thomas left for work as if nothing had happened. When he returned later that day, his sister confronted him, saying she had seen Casey's body in the basement. But rather than going to the authorities, she told him she didn't want to know what had happened and demanded he dispose of the body immediately. Terrified by the ongoing search and media attention, Thomas kept Casey's body in the basement for a full week. Once the attention died down, he rented a pickup truck, drove her body to St. Louis, and left it in a remote area. Thomas was eventually arrested, charged, and sentenced to death. But he never lived to see execution. He died in prison from health complications a few years later. When questioned about Angie Hausman's murder, Thomas denied any involvement. With no evidence connecting him to Angie's case, detectives came to believe that the two crimes were unrelated. With that conclusion, the investigation into Angie's murder once again stalled. Months passed with no new leads, and public attention slowly faded. As time went on, detectives faced yet another challenge: the expiration of the initial reward money. There was concern that without a financial incentive, tips from the public would stop altogether. Then, in 2001, an unexpected lifeline arrived. A local businessman stepped forward and donated $250,000 as a reward for information leading to Angie's killer. At the time, it was one of the largest rewards ever offered in the region. The announcement brought a surge of new tips, and for a moment, hope returned. But one by one, each lead was investigated, and each one led nowhere. The trail had gone cold again. The case remained dormant until 2001, when detectives received a surprising phone call from an inmate named Corey Fox. Serving time in prison, Fox confessed to more than 10 murders, among them the killing of Angie Hausman. Eager for answers, detectives rushed to interview him. Fox detailed how he and an accomplice had abducted Angie from the street, keeping her hidden in his home for several days. He claimed their original plan was to demand a ransom, but they ultimately decided to kill her, fearing she could identify them. To the investigators' surprise, Fox described several accurate details, including how Angie was tied to a tree and how her underwear had been used as a gag. He even mentioned her being found with her head wrapped in tape. But soon, inconsistencies emerged. When asked what had been used to restrain her hands, Fox said plastic handcuffs, yet police knew iron ones had been used. Further digging revealed that Fox couldn't have committed several of the other murders he confessed to, casting doubt on his entire story. Detectives concluded he likely fabricated parts of his confession, possibly pulling details from the extensive media coverage of Angie's case over the years. Then, in the summer of 2002, the case gained renewed public attention after a 6-year-old girl was abducted from her home in a different part of St. Louis and murdered. Initially, police considered a connection to Angie's case, but within hours, the neighbor responsible was arrested and confessed to the crime, eliminating any link to Angie's killer. Years passed once more without answers, until 2007, when detectives decided to revisit the case files with fresh eyes. As they combed through the original reports, one small detail stood out. Shortly after Angie's body was discovered, officers had noted a parked vehicle near the crime scene. Inside was a man named Roger Martin. Questioned at the time, Martin told police he was there to hunt, but when they briefly inspected his car, there was no hunting gear in sight. This discovery prompted the newly assigned detective team to dig deeper into Roger Martin's background. What they found was disturbing. Martin had a criminal history involving offenses against children, and chillingly, one of those assaults occurred in the same wooded area where Angie's body had been found. All of these crimes had taken place before Angie's death, and the information was readily available in police databases. Yet for reasons still unclear, investigators at the time had never seriously pursued Roger as a suspect. The new team decided it was time to start from scratch. Roger was brought in for questioning. He flatly denied any connection to Angie's murder, claiming he'd been in the area by coincidence. He insisted that during the time Angie was believed to have been left there, he was at work, though detectives were unable to verify his alibi. After a 9-hour interrogation, police were left with more questions than answers. As part of their renewed investigation, they collected Roger's fingerprints and compared them to the print found on the tape wrapped around Angie's head. The result was definitive: no match. With no physical evidence tying him to the crime, Roger was released. Although detectives didn't officially clear him, they simply didn't have enough to move forward. The case would remain stagnant until 2018, when the St. Louis Police Department created a special task force focused solely on Angie's murder. Armed with modern forensic tools and fresh determination, this team began a full-scale review of the evidence collected in 1993. They zeroed in on 3 critical items: the handcuffs, the tape used to bind Angie's head, and the piece of her underwear used as a gag. Despite repeated attempts over the years, no DNA profile had ever been recovered from these items, but the new team wasn't ready to give up. They believed modern advancements in DNA analysis might finally yield what earlier techniques could not, and they sent the evidence back to the lab for a fresh examination. Investigators began their renewed forensic examination with the handcuffs, hoping to find any trace of foreign DNA. But this proved difficult. The metal was almost entirely coated in Angie's blood, making the recovery of other biological material nearly impossible. Next, they turned their attention to the tape that had been wrapped around Angie's head. But when they opened the evidence box, they were met with disappointment. The tape had degraded badly over time, literally crumbling in their hands, rendering it useless for DNA analysis. With 2 pieces of evidence down, the team shifted to their final option, the piece of Angie's underwear that had been used to gag her. At first glance, this too seemed like a long shot. The fabric had been inside her mouth for hours, and experts feared that any trace of the killer's DNA would have been erased or overwhelmed by Angie's own. Still, they pressed on. Using cutting-edge forensic technology, the lab technicians painstakingly scanned every fiber of the material, and finally, their patience paid off. A minute but viable sample of unknown male DNA was recovered. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The DNA profile was uploaded to the FBI database, and expectations were kept low. In many cold cases, this process leads nowhere. But this time, the results came back immediately and definitively. The DNA was a perfect match to Earl Webster Cox, a 58-year-old man who had been incarcerated since 2003. Cox had never been linked to Angie's case before, but his criminal history was extensive and disturbing. Detectives went to the prison to confront Earl Cox, but as soon as they sat down, he shut them down, denying any involvement and immediately requesting a lawyer. With his DNA already confirmed on the key evidence, investigators knew his chances in court were slim. But instead of banking solely on the forensic match, they chose a different tactic. They reached out to Cox's attorney and laid out their position. If he didn't confess, they'd pursue the death penalty. However, if he admitted to the crime, the prosecution would take capital punishment off the table and instead seek life imprisonment without parole. It didn't take long for Cox to make his decision. Understanding the strength of the case against him, he agreed to the terms. When detectives returned to the prison, he offered a confession, though parts of it didn't quite add up. Still, for the investigators, the most important piece was now secured: a direct admission to Angie's murder. Cox claimed that on November 18, 1993, he happened to be driving near the neighborhood where his mother and sister lived. According to him, his car stalled. While checking under the hood, a school bus stopped nearby, dropping off several children. He claimed all of them went inside, except one, Angie. He said she walked over, and they started talking. Noticing she looked cold, he offered her a ride to warm up, and she supposedly accepted. Cox alleged that he took her to Burger King, bought her food, then brought her back to his home, where he kept her for several days and sexually assaulted her. Eventually, Cox said, he decided to let her go, but instead of returning her home, he drove her to a wooded area, tied her to a tree, and left her there alive. Detectives didn't believe the story, at least not all of it. Angie was just minutes from home when she vanished. It was hard to believe she would willingly get into a stranger's car, especially one who wasn't from the neighborhood. Cox's tale about the broken-down car starting just in time seemed even more suspicious. In all likelihood, he had spotted Angie walking alone and made a deliberate, premeditated decision to abduct her, using deception or force. Regardless, the confession gave prosecutors what they needed. In August 2020, Earl Cox was brought before a judge and formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But there was a somber absence in the courtroom. Angie's mother had passed away from cancer in 2016, never living to see justice for her daughter. Her husband Ronald told reporters, "Earl Cox should have been convicted of 2 murders. He didn't just kill Angie, he killed my wife too. She never recovered." And Earl's story didn't end with that sentence. Prosecutors reopened a past case involving 2 7-year-old girls who had been sexually abused by Cox, a crime for which he'd previously faced no serious consequences, serving just a year for a parole violation. Detectives contacted one of those victims, now an adult, and asked her to testify. She agreed. Earl, now facing overwhelming evidence and multiple charges, pleaded guilty again. He was handed an additional 10-year sentence. When the judge gave her the opportunity to speak, the victim stood and addressed the court. She said that despite what Cox had done to her as a child, she would live a full, happy life, and he would rot behind bars, exactly where he belonged.